الرحيم.
اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. سل إماما عاش في العلم دهورا ودهور، يطلب العلم ببذل حتى ضمته البحور. سل إماما عاش في العلم دهورا ودهور، يطلب العلم ببذل حتى ضمته البحور. صابرا في العلم صبرا حتى سموه الصبور، يخرج العلم بفأل مثل ريحان الزهور. صابرا في العلم صبرا حتى سموه الصبور، يخرج العلم بفأل مثل ريحان الزهور. اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. كن إذا سموك اسما لتكن مثل الحضور، كن رفيقا كن عظيما كن كما تلك الصقور. كن إذا سموك اسما لتكن مثل الحضور، كن رفيقا كن عظيما كن كما تلك الصقور. راقيا بالعلم نحو النجم مزدان شكور، رافضا كل التدني رافضا نفس الغرور. اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. ابن مسعود فقيه عالم أحيا القفور، فإذا أعطاك رأيا كان سهما في النحور. ابن مسعود فقيه عالم أحيا القفور، فإذا أعطاك رأيا كان سهما في النحور. وعلي ثم بالدين معاذ لا يبور، اقرأوا التاريخ تروي عنه أفواه سطور. اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. إن سألت عن إمام أو فقيه في الأمور، ابن عباس ترنم وسيبقى في الصدور. إن سألت عن إمام أو فقيه في الأمور، ابن عباس ترنم وسيبقى في الصدور. فهو كالشمعة تذهب حتى تأتينا بنور، ساهر بالليل علم وبأوقات سحور. اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. إذ بكى النبي يوما سمعا صوتا جهور، يا أبي كم روت عنك الليالي والعصور. إذ بكى النبي يوما سمعا صوتا جهور، يا أبي كم روت عنك الليالي والعصور. أنتم اليوم كنبت قد علا فوق الجذور، يا أساس الدين يا صرحنا يا صلب صخور. اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور.
لله رب العالمين. Salatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh, and welcome to Islamic Oasis Live. Alhamdulillah, as always, brothers and sisters, we, this month especially, and of course before this, we have tried our best, and alhamdulillah, to bring to you teachers, activists, scholars, intellectuals, thinkers from all sectors of the Muslims in the United States. Brothers from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, people who have written books, people who have worked in war zones. And today, subhanAllah, we have Brother Hakeem Muhammad with us. We were sharing this book the other day. This is one of the books which they have, with another author. They've co-authored this book. A book that must be, inshallah, understood. We are going to discuss this book today. But let me give you a little bit of background of our brother here. Brother Hakeem Muhammad is a lawyer focused on protecting the rights of African Americans within marginalized inner cities and litigates police conduct, police brutality cases. He has also lectured on critical race theory at universities such as Harvard, California, Berkeley, and Michigan State. Brother Hakeem Muhammad accepted Islam at the age of 16. He is one of the founders of Black Dawah Network, a group dedicated to bringing and teaching of Islam to the inner cities at a grassroots level in the way that addresses concerns unique to African Americans. Brother Hakeem, welcome to Islamic Oasis Live.
Assalamu alaikum, brother. Thank you for inviting me. I'm immensely grateful to be here to speak with you, brother.
MashaAllah, tabarakallah, Sheikh. First of all, you're a lawyer, and you are you were in from Northeastern.
That's where I went to law school at Northeastern.
You went to law school there, MashaAllah, tabarakallah.
In Boston, yeah.
In Boston. So, and then right after that, you start. Give me a little bit of background on the Dawah Network. What is the Dawah Network? Because majority of your books that you guys are writing, and there are many, mashallah, it always says Dawah Network. So tell me about this and tell me about yourself a little bit more.
Sure. So I grew up in the south side of Chicago. In the area that I'm from, that I grew up in Chicago, is notorious in terms of gang violence, in terms of back and forth killings, back and forth shootings. And when I was first exposed to the message of Islam, the moral precepts that Islam promotes, you really see the necessity that Islamic morals and Islamic virtues have and the role that Islam has to play in really reawakening the morals of the people. And so you see the transformation that Islam has historically led to, and not just Detroit Red, who was transformed into Malcolm X, but so many others. And so in terms of the establishment of Black Dawah Network, we wanted to promote these virtues, these morals that Islam calls to within different inner cities, whether it be the south side of Chicago or other inner cities across America that are plagued with similar issues. So that is the inception and the origins of Black Dawah Network.
So this is how many years now?
So the way that we began was Brother Sharif and I, who was a co-author of this book, we noticed that within the African American community, there were these individuals who were alleging that Islam and being an African American were incompatible, that Islam was for Arabs, it was not for Black people. And of course, we take immense umbrage at such claims because we know that Islam has the solutions to problems plaguing African American communities, problems plaguing the inner cities. And we saw the need to be proactive in terms of clarifying and explaining why Islam holds these sort of solutions. And especially when I was a younger Muslim, I saw on YouTube there are many different dawah organizations, many people giving dawah, but there was a lack of focus on African American communities, and so we wanted to bridge that gap and focus on the unique concerns that plague African Americans, and so that's our genesis.
Now, you've written a book that is almost 515 pages. Co-authored. What is, when you say the Muslim guide, okay, who are the audience for this particular book?
It's the Ummah, it's Muslims who need to understand how structural racism impacts Black America. That's the audience for this book.
Okay, so again, I'm going to put this book up here, brothers. This is an amazing book that we need to, every Muslim, intellectuals in general, need to look at this book. So when you say structural racism, Sheikh Hani, what does that mean? Structural racism meaning, is the system racist?
So the way that when we say structural racism, we're referring to how the institutions within America are designed to establish a white over black hierarchy from its very inception, from how the political system in America was conceived of, from how African Americans as well as Native Americans were excluded from every aspect of mainstream American social, political, and economic life. When we say structural racism, and especially for Muslims, we need to understand how when Africans were were first brought here to America, as you know, Brother Malcolm would say, we didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us. Many of those early people, black people, came to America. They were Muslims, but as a direct result of white supremacy, there were laws in the books that said Africans must be forcibly Christianized, that Africans should not practice their faith. And so you have a remarkable history of when Africans were brought here to America, they reproduced entire copies of the Quran purely from memory. You read some of the slave narratives of Omar ibn Said, of Abu Bakr. They're lamenting the fact that Islam may not survive in future generations as a direct impact that these racist laws had upon them that said that they cannot practice Islam, that they were forced to be Christians. And so when we think about structural racism, especially for Muslims, it literally inhibited the ability of Africans to transgenerationally transmit Islamic knowledge. So for any Muslim, we have to be concerned about structural racism and its impact.
Structural racism. I mean, is there a relationship between, Patriot law, for instance, and this was used after 9/11, for instance, right, to crush Islam in this country in many ways. Muslims who were active literally put the active Muslims under the rug somewhere. People got worried, scared, all of that, and that just happened after 9/11. So let's say in the last 20 years. Right? All of this is happening to Muslims. But what you're describing is something that's been happening for the last 400 years.
Absolutely.
So can you connect the dots here? I mean, so that Muslims can actually feel what's going on. Because we felt it, but nothing what you have felt.
There's absolutely a connection. For example, when we look at what the wicked American soldiers did in Iraq in terms of Abu Ghraib and the torture, the humiliation, the dehumanization of Muslims in those prison sites in Abu Ghraib, though some of those very leaders who were perpetrating that torture, they were previously sued by African Americans in prison for perpetrating some of these same atrocities. So they were prison guards and they went over to Abu Ghraib later in their career to inflict some of these same torture against Muslims. When we look at some of the people who were leading interrogations of Muslims in Guantanamo Bay, some of them had their head start here in Chicago, where they were using torture and abuse in order to coerce confessions to get people to confess the crimes that they did not commit. So America transports its white supremacy that it inflicts upon black people internationally, and this is something that Muslims must be absolutely cognizant of.
SubhanAllah, there's a lot. We've spoken to a lot of brothers, by the way. We had on this show brothers who were in prison, especially in Guantanamo. Some of them were in there for 14 years. Some of the brothers were in there for 24, long terms. I don't know if you know Brother Beg, who was in for 3 years, I think, 3 or 6 years. And then he started something called Cage in UK. And so when you talk about police brutality, because you have the first chapter here is talking about, it's African American Muslim case against systematic in law enforcement. Expand on that a little bit, because what I'm going to do is kind of go over some of the chapters one by one, because you've done it with structured work, and then you end with education and what we need to do to create a professional class. Right? I mean, unless I'm getting it wrong, but that's the way I read the book. So what do you mean, and what is the case against law enforcement?
Sure. So when we talk about systemic racism within American law enforcement and its policing system, we should be aware of the fact that it's not limited to unjustified police killings of African Americans. Rather, it manifests itself in other ways as well. So, for example, police are more likely to conduct searches of African Americans, and what the studies say is that those searches of African Americans are not productive. They have a higher hit rate when they search white people than when they search black people, meaning African Americans are being subjected to harassment by the police in the form of searches that cannot be supported by probable cause or reasonable articulable suspicion. There's also been a direct link between excessive police force and residential segregation. So police are more likely to use excessive force on on neighborhoods that have a high concentration of African Americans in comparison with other areas. When we, in the studies and the data on this is clear, and it's also cited in this book that they've done studies on police officers where they've shown that police officers are more likely to misidentify objects belonging to African Americans, such as their wallet, such as other inanimate objects, as a gun or some sort of lethal firearm. They're more likely to misidentify that as a weapon than similarly situated white Americans. Also, the data is very explicit and clear the way in which these police officers in the United States are, when they use they've done studies where police officers are en masse using racial slurs across their social media, and of course that attitude impacts the way that they do policing. They've done studies on the wrongful convictions of African Americans, and what they found is that African Americans are not only more likely to be wrongfully convicted of crime, more likely to be subjected to a prison sentence for crime that they did not commit, but that police perjury in their trials played a greater role in wrongful convictions of African Americans than white Americans. So these are just some examples beyond the high profile police shootings of African Americans for how police and law enforcement are saturated with racism.
So Sheikh, I mean, when we talk about, this patriot law, how much more pressure is on Muslim African Americans? I mean, you are Muslim, black, and you see what I'm saying? I mean, it's one thing that we're Muslims, fine, we're minorities, we're Muslims. I understand when I walk on the street like this, or if I walk into a plane, at least in the last whatever years, now it's not as bad, but how much worse is it to be black and Muslim in this country?
Well, alhamdulillah, to be black and Muslim, it's an honor.
No. I don't mean to say that way.
I know how much pressure we get.
That's what I'm saying. I mean, it's
how much pressure we get to the state. But of course, brother, we're under immense oppression. Yes. We're under immense repression in every single way. And in fact, a lot of, as I discussed earlier, a lot of what America has done to destabilize other countries, to interfere with the Ummah abroad, it has its origins in the COINTELPRO program that was first inflicted upon African American political organizations.
And it seems like that's been used for every. Okay, so for instance, used against Black Panthers, used against what else? What else? How does that play out till today? I mean, how do you see COINTELPRO, for instance? Do we still see that happening today, or is it? How does it play out today, these laws that were put together at that time? Because this was, I guess, the original formation of FBI. FBI was formed, and then COINTELPRO was formed to destroy basically any movement that would create any type of revolutionary type. Do you still see that happening today? I mean,
absolutely, brother. The government always played this role in attempting to destabilize African American organizations. There are always individuals who seek to infiltrate certain movements from the FBI that seeks to steer it in another direction. Is common in different black political groups as well as Muslims groups. It's an ongoing thing. COINTELPRO never stopped. Their methods may evolve, but the purpose is the same, which is to inhibit any real challenge to white supremacy in the United States.
So then you go from chapter 1, then you have African, okay, why the African, look, because, I mean, it could have been, because every chapter is named the African American Muslim case.
Yes.
Against racism, in
yes.
access to educational opportunities, or, why such a repetition? I mean, was there a design? I mean,
well, brother, I think it's important. At the time that we wrote this book, unfortunately, there were many mainstream figures within the Muslim community who are seeking to deny systemic racism, making commentary, offering political commentary that was replete with ignorance in terms of the plight of African Americans. So as African Americans and as Muslims, we wanted to make our case as to how America is saturated with racism in every single one of its institutions, from the policing system to the criminal legal system to the healthcare system to its economic system. America is saturated with racism, and something that Malcolm X said is that they always are coming out with, just like they come out with a new car They always coming out with a new edition of racism. It evolves and it's changed, but fundamentally, America at its core is racist against its African American population.
Can you give me an example? I know you're talking about, for instance.
So, for example, the economic system. Yeah.
Okay.
The economic system in America, they've done studies that even until 2043, 2043, the black-white wealth gap is going to increase. It's going to increase. There's no sign under the existing political system of America. There is no end to this immense wealth gap that is a result of slavery between black Americans and white Americans. And they've further done studies. Duke University did a study where they determined that contrary to this right-wing myth that your wealth, your money is a product of your merit or a product of your individual hard work and labor, they've done studies that have indicated that inheritance, meaning wealth that you get merely from being in a certain family and having wealth passed down to you, that plays a larger role than in the black-white wealth gap than any other factor.
Gives you access.
And even African Americans who are at higher educational levels than white people, there's still an immense wealth gap, and that education that African Americans have been able to acquire is not sufficient to solve the black-white wealth gap at all. And so we see that African Americans.
But here's the thing: but isn't that happening in? Look, capitalism creates classes. Right? I mean, it's not Marxism. Karl Marx talks about the natural tendency of capitalism to create classes. Fine, but so isn't that natural that the capitalists you will see a lower class, a middle class, this class, that class, or is it? Why are you saying that no? Blacks specifically, instead of saying that look, there's going to be a lower class.
Well,
that is generated, by design in capitalism.
So certainly capitalism produces different people and different economic strategies. It's an inevitable product of it. But when we look at structural racism, it functions as a barrier to inhibit African Americans from acquiring wealth to begin with, and disproportionately creates an impoverished African American class. That's the product of structural racism.
So you're saying that there's already this.
African Americans have an added disadvantage when it comes to wealth accumulation, and already we know capitalism in and of itself is a destructive force that creates these immense disparities.
Yes.
However, structural racism is another contributing force for African Americans being disproportionately impoverished, and functions as a major barrier to access to wealth, access to a decent standard of living.
Man, I mean, that's... So where do we start to recover here? I mean, is there recovery in this system? I mean, this is beyond... you're talking about getting to a certain level and then starting it again. I mean, because the way the structure is set up, man, it's like a structure to fail. Right? I mean, am I right to say that? I mean, capitalism
You're correct to say
so.
that.
And then if you're fighting a system that is designed to fail you, what is the solution?
Well, brother, we propose in that book different solutions. African Americans can. So we know that structural racism, is replete in America, and in that book we do adopt different proposals or solutions for how we, as African Americans, as Muslims, can work to empower our community. But we do have to come to the realization that structural racism, white supremacy, capitalism, that these are all replete within American society. American society is saturated within racism, and it cannot be reformed away.
It cannot be reformed. Okay, so you do understand that the system is designed to fail us in general.
It was designed to oppress African Americans. It was designed to oppress African Americans.
You not us.
Well, what do you mean when you say us?
What I mean is that, like, if you look at the world, right, the whole world is suffering under capitalism.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it's suffering. The kind of poverty that you see, for instance, in overseas, in Asia and others, these are direct consequences of policies of capitalism. Right? Direct, whether it's war, whether it's all out, through IMF policies, so-called Washington consensus, all kinds of structural work that IMF does to create poverty to a level that we've never seen before, right? I mean, you're
Yeah,
talking about, so that's something that's happening across the world.
So absolutely. So without a doubt, we see capitalism rearing its ugly impact on people across the globe, different races across the United States. But what is unique about what African Americans is facing is that structural racism does not merely just impact black people on an economic level. It also impacts black people in terms of their access to healthcare, in terms of their access to education, in terms of even they've done studies, brother, where white people who are on a lower economic strata, they still have more access in terms of housing, and they are more likely to have access to housing than black people on a higher economic level. And also they've done studies in terms of environmental racism, the way in which African Americans in the United States, the way that African Americans in the United States were housed. There were housing policies in the United States where African Americans were forced in by design to live in areas that had garbage incinerators, toxic waste dumps, and all sorts of cancer-causing materials, and that impacted black people even at a higher economic level. And so when we talk about structural racism, it's not just an issue of class, it's not just an issue of it transcends economics, the impact of structural racism on black people.
So Sheikh, as Muslims,
yes,
when we're talking, how important is it that Muslims, other than blacks, understand this situation and have an understanding of what's happening?
It's crucially important. As Muslims, we are taught that we've been put into nations and tribes.
Come in a little bit more.
As Muslims, we are taught that we've been put into nations and tribes in order to get to know one another. Structural racism functions as an epistemic barrier that inhibits us from properly getting to know one another. So for example, structural racism contributes to different stereotypes. It contributes to segregation, where people of different colors cannot properly get to know one another. And so as Muslims, it's very vital that we understand how structural racism impacts the ummah. The beginning of this book, it talks about the different African Muslims who were brought to this country against their will from Omar ibn Said, who studied Islam in Timbuktu. Yet in his journal, in his slave biography, Omar ibn Said is like, I've forgotten much of the Arabic language. They've made it so that I cannot openly practice Islam. When you read, there's a heartbreaking slave narrative by Abu Bakr, who in his slave narrative, he's like, Islam may not survive in my family, and he's pleading with Allah that his future descendants, that they remain Muslims, because he could not properly practice Islam and all of the obligations of Islam on the slave plantation. And so as Muslims, we need to be aware of the impact that these laws, these racist laws that said Africans must be forcibly Christianized, had on the early Muslims who were brought to this country against their will, and what a barrier that it served to the da'wah, to the transgenerational transmission of Islamic knowledge. We need to know about the Bahia slave rebellion. That was a slave rebellion that was initiated by African Muslims. This is part of our history. This is part of who we are as Muslims.
Sheikh, I mean, subhanAllah, every mashallah, tabarakallah, there is a lot to unpack. When you talk about someone who's saying that he's worried that his future and his descendants may not be Muslim, I mean, we see a lot of that, right? I mean, we have in African American communities, we have names Fatima, you have Hakeem, you have these Muslim names, but then they have no understanding that their forefathers were Muslims. So I get two questions for you. One, what happened here that Muslim names are there, but Islam is no longer there? And second, how important is it for African Americans, because obviously we're talking about African Americans, that they connect to their history as Muslims in Africa and beyond than just slavery in this country?
It is extremely important. Our history goes back way further than slavery. Black people, absolutely. So we need to know, especially African Americans. See, one of the impacts of white supremacy is this inferiority complex that has been bred in African Americans, where we're taught to see ourselves as inferior to other people. And when you look at for example, there was an Islamic scholar in West Africa by the name of Mohammed Bello. When Europeans traveled to West Africa, he was reading Euclidean books on geometry. There was another brother, Sultan Muhammad, who said to have read over 26,000 books. There were Africans who were brought to America, and even after enduring the trauma of the transatlantic slave trade, they were able to produce entire books on the Maliki school of Islamic jurisprudence purely from memory. If we just think about, as African Americans, if our people knew about the rich intellectual history of Timbuktu, we see in America our schools, our public schools are under-resourced, underfunded. They often read on lower reading levels as a direct result of a lack of education. Just imagine reacquainting them with Timbuktu in the Mali Empire, where Ibn Battuta, who went to Timbuktu, said money was made from the book trade than any other line of business. That is what an Arab said when he went to Timbuktu. More money is made from the book trade than any other line of business. But today, as a direct product of white supremacy, you have many inner cities where the drug economy is the number one line of business, where people have been so deprived. And so it is essential, brother, that we get reacquainted with our Islam.
What you have read, it's not being read by the average African American, or even mentality that you have, that got you into saying that, hold on, there's so much more out there that I was by design cut off.
Mm-hmm. To have a walk face on the planet Earth. They never taught me about this. So of course, brother, we have to, as Muslims, as people who have been, the best nation, who have been raised up for mankind to enjoy what is good and to forbid what is evil, we have to take the leading role in educating our people who have not been educated as to who they are. And I think Malcolm X is an excellent bridge to sort of begin that process. Malcolm X is one of the most respected and revered leader among us as African Americans. And Malcolm X, he always emphasized studying history. That history is best qualified to reward our research. So we have to really take the leadership role as Muslims in teaching people about our Islamic heritage.
Can you address the decolonization part?
The decolonization
of the literature.
Decolonize
the minds, decolonize the literature, decolonize the history for a moment. Why is that so important? Because what I'm saying is, I don't get to read when I'm reading this, right? Like, I can't find this book in
Barnes and Noble.
I can't. Right? That was my first. I was telling you, how come I can't find this book there? Right? I mean, of course, now you found Amazon, other things like this, so you can't find it in Amazon, of course. But why can't I find this book there? So is that by design, or is that by, or not just this book, right? The books that you mentioned, Sokoto Caliphate, Usman Dan Fodio, may Allah have mercy on him, all of these type of leadership people, we can't find that in. So you had to have a very specific vision. You had to have something inside you that said, I need to find these books, and then you had access. It's not that it's not there in English language. You obviously read them in English. I don't know how many languages you speak, but I'm just saying you obviously read it in English language. What is it that's got you there? So
for me,
and why isn't this still in the Barnes and Noble?
So this is a self-published book. Me and my brother Sharif, we self-published this book because that's what we have to do. We can't expect that the mainstream bookstores will put out this type of material, that mainstream publishers will want to publish this type of material. So we have to take our own initiative in terms of fulfilling the gap when there's knowledge that needs to be conveyed to the masses of the people. Now, as far as decolonialization, of course, the way that we've been taught to think is to think in a very Eurocentric manner. So, for example, they're still teaching, Columbus discovered America. They still aren't properly teaching our history as black people, or our history as Muslims, as an ummah. So that is just something, brother, that we really just have to take the initiative on. There's no reason why we as Muslims can't teach history to our people, provide alternative vehicles of knowledge to acquaint them with the history, the rich history of their people, whether it be Askia Muhammad, whether it be Uthman Dan Fodio, whether it be Mansa Musa. We have to take the initiative in terms of reacquainting our people with their Islamic heritage and get them out of this Western Eurocentric worldview and way of thinking.
Actually, I mean, how much do you think the ignorance of history, not knowing history, has played in this inferiority complex?
Oh, brother, it's very vital. It's very essential. I mean, that's why during slavery, and this is something that this book discusses, the Muslim Guide for Understanding Structural Racism and its Impact on Black America. Did you know, brother, that it was once in the law that if a black man or a black woman read, they had to be lashed 20 times? That was the law. Corporal punishment just for reading a book. That was the law in the United States. And there was a Supreme Court decision, Dred versus Scott.
How long did that go on? How many years? 100, 200?
Brother, up until the end of slavery, it was a crime for black people to read. And when they passed the Dred versus Scott decision, the Supreme Court held that black people had no rights which a white person were bound to respect, that we were inferior beings, we are an inferior people, and that white America can have its way with us. And this way of thinking was foundational to the people who worked to create this modern world. For example, we hear about Immanuel Kant and the categorical imperative. Immanuel Kant advocated for beating black people with bamboo sticks because he believed that we were less susceptible to pain, that we had higher degrees of pain tolerance than white people. When we look at John Locke, who advocated for the killing of black people who were enslaved, and that the slave master had an unconditional right to enact this sorts of punishment. So white supremacy is very foundational in the creation of this modern world. It's had its impact on black people, and as Muslims, we know what a wicked system white supremacy is, and we have to be the ones to confront it head on without any sugarcoating.
And and Jazakallah khair. Wallah, I appreciate every word that's coming out of your mouth, and because of the courage to say things the way they are. And that's something we are missing on the other side, right? We are so worried about rocking the boat. Is it because we are, we're taking the fruits of your labor? I mean, 400 years of cheap labor, of killing, brutality, and now we come here and we're telling somebody else to say, "Hey, shut up! Don't say a word, because don't rock my boat."
Yeah, brother. Many Muslims who come here, and of course, without any generalizing, this is just a general statement. Many Muslims who come here, they get too comfortable. They just love the trinkets that American society offers them. They want to live the American dream, which for black people, as Malcolm X said, is nothing but an American nightmare. Black people in the hood, black people who are at the receiving end of structural racism in Americans inner cities, they aren't living a comfortable life. They're living as the housing conditions that this book talks about. African Americans are living in the worst housing conditions in the United States, especially in Chicago, as this book discusses. They built and forced the Chicago Housing Authority passed racially restrictive covenants where African Americans were forced to live in housing that had inferior plumbing, inadequate plumbing, near garbage incinerators, near toxins. And even as Jim Crow ended, African Americans are still living in inferior housing. And so absolutely, many Muslims who come here, they want to live off the fruits of our slave labor and what we put into building this country without confronting this evil system of white supremacy. And that is unfortunate. And it is something that as Muslims, we should really be cognizant of how this country was built off the backs of black people. And we should not want to be in any way, shape, or form complicit in the degradation and the humiliation and the oppression that America has offered and inflicted upon its black population.
But why do you think that's? I mean, look, we've gotten so comfortable. I mean, how do we even start with this? I mean, to be able to address this type of oppression, okay, let's ask the question: how much has secularism played the role in this comfort that we're seeing today, of the Muslims? For instance, I'll give you an example. You mentioned here the things, the kind of historical figures that you were mentioning here. How much do you think that secularism plays the role in removing these figures from the books?
Well, brother, we know in terms of teaching about these great historical figures of Islam.
Go ahead. Yes.
So is your question, how is secularism contributing to them not teaching about these Muslim figures in their history books?
Well, that's one thing, but also, look, at the end of the day, many of these figures were religious figures also.
Correct.
Right? These guys were, leading figures. They were imams. They were khulafa in many ways. So when you are secularizing the books, when you're secularizing nations, peoples, communities, does it happen structurally that these people are removed from the books and history by design? Because they are not secular. I mean, they're not. You see what I'm saying? I mean, talking about them would be like talking about going backwards, as some Muslims would say.
So, are you talking about Europeans doing this? Or are you talking about the secularization of Muslims in their minds?
I'm saying in general. I mean, obviously, the Muslims, unfortunately, a lot of Muslim countries are today secular, and they're capitalist to the core. Yeah. Right. So, naturally, the heroes would be secular and capitalist. John Locke would be a hero for them, right? Immanuel Kant would be a hero because these are secular, capitalist to the core. So what I'm saying is, I mean, just by adopting these things, we are by default, by ourselves, removing our heroes from our own books.
Understood. Yes, brother. So many Muslims who come here, when we talk about secularization, it goes hand in hand with materialism. It goes hand in hand with this so-called American dream where their ambitions are confined to this worldly life and they want whatever America can offer them in terms of its trinkets, in terms of its way of life. So of course they want to be acquainted with, these rich Muslim historical figures, these Muslims such as Uthman Dan Fodio, these Muslims such as Mansa Musa, and that's by design.
That's by design.
It's by design, brother.
You mentioned a few things here, Sheikh. I mean, let's go back. I mean, you mentioned there is another book that one of the authors here wrote, which is Afrocentrism. Right?
A Black Muslim Critique by Brother Sharif Muhammad.
Yes, Brother Sharif Muhammad here, and it was so. What's the difference when we say Eurocentrism? Let's not go to Eurocentric, but then there are some African Americans who say let's go to Afrocentric. Is there a contradiction?
Well, when we say Afrocentrism is something that African Americans sort of conceived of and invented in order to challenge Eurocentrism. And you can say in some ways they had sincere intentions in terms of black people's history not being well respected. We know Hegel once said that Africa is a place that has no history, that we're a childlike people, that Africans never built anything. And so Afrocentrism, you can say that they wanted to sort of correct Eurocentric European interpretations of world history, but where they went wrong and why we as Muslims are very critical of sort of these sorts of Afrocentrist polemicists is that in fact, their perception of Islam, where they see Islam as this Arab religion, where they often use and borrow unknowingly European colonial sources about Islam and hence adopt an anti-Islamic stance. And so this is what the book Afrocentrism, A Black Muslim Critique addresses.
Sheikh, you said that, look, when we came to education, right, you said if people were lashed, and African Americans were lashed 20 lashes just to be able to
pick up a book.
Now, of course, when we talk about Islam, it starts with
Iqra.
Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq. How important is Islam for African Americans? If you can connect these two dots, Islam came and said Iqra, and everything else came with 20 lashes, just to pick up a book. Can you expound on that?
Sure, brother. So Islam has always been perceived in the African American community as a savior, as a righteous force. And this, you spoke earlier about African Americans having Muslim names despite not knowing much about Islam. And this is a phenomenon in the African American community where you see many adopting Islamic names. But the reason for this is really a testimony to the strength of Islam in the African American community. Many people have seen their relatives.
In some ways.
Yeah, many people have seen their relatives who is a religion that elevates the morals of a people who want to do right. By learning the religion of Islam, hundreds of thousands of American Negroes are turning away from drugs, from fornication, from alcohol, and all of these other evil vices. And so Islam, and this is why there's such an antagonistic perception of Islam by the white power structures, because it's creating strong, stable communities where they want these communities to be single parent homes. They want these communities to be inflicted by promiscuity. They want these communities to be addicted to drugs, to have food and liquor stores on every single corner where people are just, all they're concerned about is listening to music, drinking alcohol. They want these communities to be like this because they can further their hegemony on these areas. People are never rising up to sort of confront them for their white supremacy, confront and really have a societal impact. And this is why Malcolm X was a number one target of COINTELPRO. This is why, and there's now a lawsuit against assassination. Why Malcolm X such a target? Because him as a role model to African Americans, him as this force for African Americans that many people looked up to, many people found Islam through him. The white create strong, healthy communities.
Sheikh, you talked about, for instance, these alcohol stores and all of this. Unfortunately, many Muslims have these type of stores. Can you address that? I mean, the evil of it. What goes through your mind when you, as an African American Muslim, you walk through the neighborhood and you see Muslims coming from back home, making money by poisoning the community rather than building men like Malcolm X?
So this is an absolute evil for a Muslim to run a food and liquor store in African American inner city communities that are already suffering under the plague of structural racism. For you to go into these communities to sell liquor and to benefit from people who have not yet been exposed sufficiently to the religion of Islam, while you carry and you know what Islam is, this is an absolute evil. And as a Muslim, I would advise all of these Muslim food and liquor store owners across Chicago, across any area where they have them, that this must come to an end, that you should not be benefiting from the you should not be profiting from the ignorance that people have of God's revelation. Instead, what you should be doing is showing people the beauty of Islam, giving people beautiful dawah, not contributing to the degradation of their community through selling alcohol. Alcohol and its consumption is haram. It is forbidden. We see and this is a part of the system of white supremacy. Native American reservations, they introduced alcohol to these communities. The studies are clear that it's a criminogenic force, that alcohol contributes to crime, alcohol contributes to domestic violence. We need to clear our communities of this evil of alcohol. And I'll tell you what, and this is why I get on the Afrocentrists so heavily, because they want to say that Islam has, that, black people shouldn't be Muslims, that Islam is an antagonistic force against African people. One of the beauties of Islam is this prohibition of alcohol. During slavery, when Europeans went into West Africa, they were trading. These paganistic African tribes would be selling other black people to the white man for alcoholic beverages, and many of these tribal leaders saw Islam's prohibition against alcohol as an antidote to that sort of evil, and many of them turned to Islam because of its prohibition of alcohol. And so any Muslim who establishes a food and liquor store in the black community and sells this death and destruction to black people, I would advise you sincerely, as your Muslim brother, you must cut out this evil. This is not a good thing to sell alcohol to your people. You are tainting the image and the beautiful perception of Islam in the black community. And of course, we have the responsibility of sort of making a distinction and a delineation between what Muslims do and what Islam allows and what Islam prohibits. But you make the ability of African Americans to draw that distinction more difficult when you contribute to this destruction of selling alcohol to your people. This must come to an end.
SubhanAllah. Sheikh, on the issue of creating unstable communities, can you give me some examples of that?
Sure.
Because, for instance, where we come from back home, the American foreign policy, for instance, or just in general, Western foreign policy has always kept, and I'm trying to connect some, the similarities here, is that the idea has always been to keep the Muslim world in general unstable, constantly in crisis, never allowing it to develop, and if there are ever minds that are able to see the reality the way it is, crush them the moment they appear. I don't know if you can compare or contrast that to the inner cities and to this.
So, of course, in areas like the South Side Chicago, in areas like Compton, and different ghettos across America, you have a situation where you have large street gangs. You have a situation where many of these street gangs and street organizations are selling drugs, and they're profiting from the drug economy. And the question is, how did these ghettos emerge to begin with? It absolutely has to do with America's policies against black people. So, for example, redlining denied black people the ability to own homes, and combined with racially restrictive covenants, African Americans were put in these impoverished areas by design, and they were cut off. So they were cut off, and they were starved of resources. And once you're starved of resources, it contributes to a lack of business, a lack of investment in the communities, and there's a direct link between the educations and the resources that are provided within the educational system of within the schools of these areas, the lack of investment in those schools, and then you have the rise of the prison system. And many of these inner cities, they call it the school to prison pipeline, where the people go to these underfunded schools, these schools that no one really invests in, that have poor quality, and many of these students, they just get pummeled straight into prison. But all of this, so for example, when we look at redlining, there's a study that this book cites that redlining had a criminogenic impact, meaning it contributed to crime in the black community. When they looked at crime rates, there's a direct correlation between the redlining of a community, the lack of investment in these communities, and the crime rates. They've done studies that map out that sort of correlation.
Is that connected to the critical race theory?
So critical race theory is something that African American legal scholars after they passed legislation allegedly getting rid of Jim Crow, allegedly getting rid of these on the face racist laws.
Allegedly defined.
Allegedly. So they passed civil. So this is something that Malcolm X pointed out, where America started passing civil rights legislation. Oh, you can't discriminate anymore. You can't segregate against black people anymore. This is now illegal under our laws, right? And so the question is, did that prevent racist policies? Did that prevent racism, or did the racism simply transform into something else? And so, for example, when you look at, there were once laws, racially restrictive covenants, which were laws that said black people can't live here. You cannot sell this home to black people. Black people can only live here under the system of racially restrictive covenants. Once they said, oh, well, you can no longer discriminate against African Americans, then what did they do? They created something that's known as blockbusting, where realtors, real estate investments, they would get white people to sell their homes by the prospect of just African Americans moving there. They would tell white people, oh, African Americans are going to move in your neighborhood. White people would flee the area, would lead to a white flight. That's why Inglewood, we were talking about Inglewood earlier. Inglewood used to be a majority white community, believe it or not. And as soon as black people began to move to Inglewood, you know what they did, brother? The white community started bombing homes of African Americans, killing African Americans, setting arsons to them, and actually deliberately killing African Americans who were moving in. And they had the white community did an entire protest where they were like, we don't want these black people here. They need to go back to Africa. And so what ended up happening is that as African Americans moved in, there was a white flight. And with that white flight, all of the economic resources were deprived from Inglewood in that area, and African Americans were subjected to immense discrimination, racial discrimination. Now, when we talk about critical race theory,
they even call it depressed areas.
Yes.
I mean, is this psychological also, trying to, calling an area depressed area? I mean, who the heck would want to live in an area called depressed?
Mm-hmm. Well, brother, so certainly no one would want to live in an area that is depressed, but the issue is African Americans who have been subjected to structural racism, they don't have the economic resources to live anywhere else. And
no, I'm saying even naming communities this way, so that resources.
So heavily influenced by Malcolm X, and he was actually one of the initial litigators to end school segregation and help to argue the case in front of the Supreme Court why America should not segregate its schools against African Americans. After they ended school segregation, what Derek Bell began to study was, even though they've ended school segregation on the law, black people are still disproportionately in segregated schools. That African Americans are still in under-resourced schools. How could this happen? How could this be when the law said black people to say the terms of engagement? And so integration in America, as Malcolm X pointed out, was a complete failure. Malcolm X pointed out how when they said, oh, we're going to integrate our schools, black people still in inferior schools, white people started creating private schools, white people started creating selective enrollment schools that black people had no access to as soon as the public schooling system became desegregated. Housing segregation, when white America discrimination in housing, they created other means to solidify this segregation in housing vis-a-vis white flight, vis-a-vis our community. And so we have to begin, within ourselves to increase to change that which is inside of ourselves, and then we can begin to see our condition change.
This is the Malcolm X part.
Yes. And so when they put drugs in our communities, we can say no to the drugs. When they want to put food and liquor stores in our community because we have no desire to drink alcohol. This is why we have to sort of strengthen our own selves on a moral level.
Sheikh, on the issue of... See, look, the only reason I guess you're able to say this is because you have your objective and there's a vision. It's clear. And you have an alternative to offer, Islam. This is why you can speak with such strength. How important is that the African Americans, obviously they're looking for an alternative, so and hence the idea of Afrocentrism, for instance. How important is it that Muslims understand the problems that obviously we have, and build strong dawah project in this country.
Brother, that was the mission of Malcolm X. When you read the last interview of Malcolm X's life before he was assassinated, Malcolm X spoke about establishing Islamic centers throughout different inner cities, where he likened it to sort of fertilizing, putting the seeds where it's most likely to be fertilized. He saw the potential of Islam within Black America to reawaken us, to uplift us on a moral level, to give us that courage necessary to challenge white supremacy, to challenge racism, and to have no fear at all. So the dawah is absolutely essential, calling human beings to worship the Creator, that Allah has no partners, that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the seal of all prophets, accepting the rightly guided caliphs. All of this is essential, is absolutely essential, and it's something that we have to pick the ball on. We need to revive the Islamic agenda of Malcolm X and never allow it to die, never allow it to fade. But we need to pick up this Islamic agenda that Malcolm X had of giving dawah throughout different Black communities in the inner cities and working to strengthen the Islamic institutions within the Black community. This is essential.
So how important is it that everyone read Malcolm X?
It's important, I think, for Muslims to really know their own history.
It goes back to what we're discussing as knowing our history,
and
knowing our heroes.
Yeah, and so, part of what influenced this book, why we had to write this book, is there were so many different Muslim commentators who were saying things about the plight of African Americans that were simply ludicrous, that were simply disrespectful to our struggle as an African American people. If they read the autobiography of Malcolm X and they knew about the history of the lynchings and they knew the history of the system of what created the ghetto, how was the ghetto created? Malcolm X talks about that in his autobiography, how the ghetto was created, how it was designed. And so we don't speak about things in a decontextualized sense, but in a contextualized sense. So Malcolm X's autobiography is a must read for Muslims.
So look, Sheikh, I'm calling it the solution section here. In that you talk about the concept of Baytul Mal and Waqf. Then you go on to taking care of the needy, and then you talk about buying land, basically building schools. The concept of Baytul Mal. I mean, what are we saying here? Are we saying that look, we need to set up a system that can help build the infrastructure inside the inner cities and create a support system? Is that what we're saying here?
It's absolutely what we need to do. We need to begin to establish Islamic institutions within the Black community, so brother, that we can teach the proper history to us as African Americans.
Look, I'm going to be honest here. So we did a lot of work for some 7 to 8 years inside the inner city. And for some reason, I mean, it could also be because of the economics. There's a lot to it, but education was something that a lot of brothers in the community were not interested in. This is something we observed, and then we kind of almost
Islamic education, or
yes, I mean, it was almost like, okay, people would be interested in zakat checks, but they would not be interested in sitting in a class to learn the deen, for instance, right? So how do we change that? What is it? Or it could just be that we didn't know what we were doing,
brother. I think it's essential.
Or we couldn't address the real issues.
I think it's essential that, for example, when we talk about Islamic classes, to have Islamic and to know the audience and know what particular people.
That's true. That's very true.
We're dealing with, who we're teaching, and to make the curriculum oriented towards them to sort of address their needs. So, for example, this is a book titled "The Deception of Street Life" by our good Muslim brother Abdul Mateen. He was a former member of the Four Corner Hustlers gang out of the West Side Chicago. He's doing a 60-year sentence for first-degree murder. And in this book, he took his shahada while he was incarcerated in Menard Correctional Facility. And in this book, the brother Abdul Mateen sort of talks about why he left gang life to join the Ummah, and really giving the broader people an awareness of why gang and street life is a deception. I think we need sort of these sorts of outreach initiatives to have brothers like him from his background teach, especially within inner city communities. I think this is essential to creating and fostering and strengthening the moral fiber of the people.
So are you saying that we should, again, I'm asking, a certain type of curriculum for the inner city?
I think we need sort of an Islamic curriculum that is geared towards the need and addresses the social ills that face the people. But Islamic education is essential. We should encourage people to seek knowledge. That is their obligation in Islam. We should make it accessible to them. We should constantly be encouraging them to do so, because we aren't going anywhere if we aren't constantly seeking to increase ourselves in knowledge.
Okay, and finally, hate it in our hearts. What are we saying here?
Sure, brother. So, of course, the ultimate objective of the Muslims and what we should be trying to do is change the system of structural racism in America, to eradicate it, to fight against it on every turn. You know, if we can't do that, we should be speaking out against it in every way. We should be raising awareness about it. This is unacceptable that this black man was murdered by the police. It absolutely has to do with racism. We need to be speaking out in every area in which structural racism impacts black people. We must speak out against it, and we must never tire of speaking out against it, no matter how annoyed people may get, no matter how much they want to hear it. We should always be speaking out against this racism of American society. And at the very least, if you all aren't willing to that, if we have Muslims who are not willing to do that, we should be hating the system of white supremacy, the system of racism in our hearts.
And finally, Sheikh, because I mean, there's so much more. I mean, the whole book is 500 pages, as I said. Why your cover? You know, I was trying to figure out, analyze. Why did you choose this specific cover?
Oh, sure, brother. So,
I mean, for instance, if you see,
so this is actually taken from an image of some brothers who were making salat inside of the prison. And I work very closely with different African Americans who are incarcerated, who have taken their shahada, and I've always been sort of amazed by the brotherhood that the Muslims have,
see the picture,
that the Muslims have inside of the prison. And I think so, and you know, I'm a strong advocate of, you know, there's so many brothers in prison who they were former gang members. They have done such in the past heinous things, but they've come to Islam, and some of the most beautiful people I've ever encountered, and they should not be being incarcerated anymore. I think, and so my heart is especially with those brothers who, you know, as a result of structural racism, lack of exposure to Islam, they may have done something heinous in their jahiliyyah, but now they've come to and accepted the religion of Islam. They want to do good. They want to contribute to this world in a beneficial way. So my heart is always with those brothers.
The picture just shows so much strength. I mean, just what else can we learn from this picture here?
Well, I do want to say that one area that structural racism is impacting Muslims, especially in the prison system, in Menard Correctional Facility, is that the brothers are trying to do Jummah. They're trying to do Jummah, and in order to join the Jummah prayer service, you have to register with the prison as a Muslim. And what's happening is the chaplain, who is a white Christian, is telling these brothers he's not accepting their conversion to Islam, them wanting to change their identity to a Muslim, and so many of them are being inhibited from accessing Jummah prayer services. I've been told that he's sending letters back to some of these prisoners who want to do Jummah, go to the Jummah prayer service, saying, accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. But despite it all, there's an immense level of brotherhood and perseverance that Muslims have inside of that prison system, and that's one thing that we want to do at Black Dawah Network. The Dawah in prison is so strong, path in life in these different street organizations, and so these are some of the initiatives. You can visit our website and you can reach out to me directly in terms of if you want to help with some of these initiatives. We would welcome the help.
So, brothers and sisters, subhanallah, as I said, you know, you can never have enough time with such brothers, subhanallah, people who are writing books, people who are, I mean, they're doing some amazing work. And it's so important, as our brother mentioned, that we open our eyes and connect with the rest of the Muslim community in many ways. I mean, subhanallah, brothers, we, how many of us, I'm saying this, how many of us are actually even connected to the masajid in the inner city? How many of us actually visit and see, subhanallah, what kind of role us as Muslims can actually play in the inner city? The other thing, brothers and sisters, subhanallah, the amount of money the Muslims spend on building and rebuilding their parking lots that are empty for Salatul Jummah. Only, you see them full in Salatul Jummah, and the rest of the days, these are empty parking lots that are built with millions of dollars, while so many centers, like brother was talking about, Malcolm X, rahmatullah alayhi, for instance, that talked about the Malcolm paradigm, that we need to build schools, we need to build centers, we need to build the infrastructure in the inner cities to bring Islam to the inner city, and use the brothers and sisters who are not only African American, Muslim, but these are intellectuals, teachers, authors that can be presented to present Islam to not only the inner city but the America as a whole. So brothers and sisters, inshallah, I encourage you to buy these books. Again, I'm putting this up there. We've been putting it up there throughout the show. This one, there's another one, The Deception of Life, actually of Street Life. There are a few other books that we have been talking about throughout the month. So please pick up these books, read these books, connect with the Muslim Dawah Network, and inshallah, let's do some work. Also for coming week, bi'iznillahi ta'ala, brothers and sisters, we do have 2 containers leaving to Sham, Syria, the next Saturday. If you can come and help us, come and help. Especially, there's going to be a lot of help needed next Saturday, bi'iznillahi ta'ala. And we're still accepting donations, new clothing, all kinds of stuff that can go there. And inshallah, jazakallah khair for being here, akhi.
Brother,
thank you so
I'm
much.
I'm immensely grateful that you invited me here
to
speak,
for you to be here,
address these important
especially
issues, brother.
For having intellectuals, authors, and teachers like you. It's very important, brother, for us, because bringing you on the show actually enhances our show. It shows that we are people who want to engage with intellectuals, and it is amazing to see brothers like you. And believe me, akhi, it really inspired me just listening to you. As you can see, the whole time I was just watching you. I wasn't even looking up there. I was looking at you. Why? Because the Muslims need role models, akhi. Especially the young Muslim brothers. They need to hear people like you, so they can learn how to take stands and not compromise their deen. Just the way you're speaking with so much strength, right, with confidence, strength in Islam. This is something that the Muslim youth need to see, because believe me, Shaykhi, majority of you would see Muslim youth talking about John Locke and Emmanuel more than they would talk about Usman Dan Fodio and Mansa Musa, for instance. And don't even be surprised, they have no idea who they are. And you were born and raised here in this country. Becoming a Muslim at 16, you know more about probably Islamic history than many of you today who came from Muslim countries. So, akhi, it was an honor to have you here.
Thank
and
you,
believe me, this is only a beginning.
Inshallah.
Yeah. And JazakumAllahu khairan, brothers and sisters. We'll see you guys next week. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
لن يطول الظلام ديننا لن يضام نحن جيل الهمام نحن فينا عمر لا 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 لن يطول الظلام ديننا لن يضام نحن جيل الهمام نحن فينا عمر صبح بدا نور ظهر نجم وشمس وقمر ألقى على الدنيا الدرر هذا عمر هذا عمر كل البرايا تنتظر أيامه البيض الغرر كي تستفيد من العبر هذا عمر هذا عمر لا لن تدوم الجراح بل سيأتي الصباح نحن أهل الكفاح نحن فينا عمر لا لن تدوم الجراح راح بل سيأتي الصباح نحن أهل